Hi, I'm Matt O'Donnell. I'm Dean of the College of Engineering. I'd like to welcome you to the last lecture in our fall series, co-sponsored with UW Alumni Association. It's my pleasure tonight to introduce our speaker, who is Linda Ng Boyle. Linda's a double Husky. She received her master's degree here in industrial engineering and received her PhD in civil and environmental engineering. So kind of an unusual path, but one that brings together her two unique skills, which have to do with human factors and transportation. And that's perfectly applied to the topic that she is going to talk about tonight. And that topic is related to driving and distraction. It's on there. Is that oh, hold on a second. Hello? Oh, nobody there. Oops. I guess I'm not supposed to do that, right? So I will holster mine. How many times do we do stupid stuff like that? All the time. The difference is I'm here in front of you. I didn't have a stage to walk off of. But obviously, there's much more dramatic consequences that can happen when you are in an active environment such as driving. Linda has, over the last 7 or 8 years, as we've brought her back to Seattle, has emerged as one of the true world's experts in this area because of, again, her transportation experience and her human factors experience. So please join me in welcoming Professor Linda Ng Boyle.
Thank you very much for having me here. I'm very, very excited to give this talk on Driven to Distraction. I like to always begin my talk by asking a couple of questions to the audience. Just a raise of hand. How many of you have seen someone, when you were driving, being distracted in the car next to you or in front? Almost everyone. I think maybe everyone. Now, my second question then is, how many of you, and be honest, has actually participated in some sort of a distracting activity when you were driving? Exactly. So this is a very hot topic in terms of a lot of people actually do it. And even though we all know that there are safety implications, we tend to do certain things that may be just distracting, and we're just trying to figure out, like, what can we do to make things better, and how do we actually inform drivers about when they may be just a little bit too distracted in certain times. So I start off by asking, or just identifying, what is driver distraction? Driver distraction basically is anything that diminishes your attention away from the primary goal of looking at the cars in front of you or the roads. And it can be anything from using your cell phone, which is what most of us are familiar with, to eating, to talking to passengers, and even just thinking about other things that are going on in the day. However, just looking at the car next to you may be very obvious to see what those distractions are. Or are they? If I was to ask you, the question is whether or not you thought this was distracting, what would you say? This is a vehicle. This is a 2002 BMW 745 iDrive. It's still on the road, and it was about $80,000 when this car came out. It's called an iDrive because it has this little device right there, and I'll blow it up for you. And what the designers did was they streamlined everything so that everything worked within one hand movement. Everything, including your radio, your climate control, your CD player. So in your car today, if I was to ask you to turn up the volume on your radio, what would you do? You would maybe go and look at the dial, or even not even look at the dial, just search for the dial and turn it up or down, right? Or some of us have right on our steering wheel a little button so that we can go up or down in the volume. In this car, to turn up the volume, you would have had to do the following. You would have had to go to that little device, the iDrive, toggle to the word entertainment, find the word radio, not CD, not GPS player, Then, from that radio, select AM or FM. Then find the knob for volume, not tuning, and then turn up or adjust the volume. So what could be just one step in some other cars is 5 steps here. So I will let you be the judge, and I don't make any judgments here, as to whether or not you think this is distracting. And there's a bunch of articles on Google and other websites that you can look at for this. So when we're talking about driver distraction and why this is such an important topic is because there's a lot of studies that show that it has a huge impact on people when they're driving. It impacts how quickly we can respond to different things that are going on in front of us. It can also impact how close we are to the car in front. It also affects our ability to attend to roadway hazards. And what all of that kind of amounts to is that if we can't attend to the roadway hazards quickly enough, if we're too close to the car in front, we have a higher likelihood of being involved in a crash. And if that is the case, you know, we can see that there's a lot of injuries and fatalities from crashes. And actually, this is a worldwide issue. As a matter of fact, worldwide, there's about 3,000 fatalities per day from motor vehicle crashes. And in the US alone, it's the #1 killer for those between the ages of 4 to 34. So this is a huge global health problem, and one that if we can do something about or try to mitigate or try to help reduce some of the effects associated with it, we can maybe make this society a little bit better. So when we're talking about doing research in driver distraction, what are some of the things that we need to look at first? Well, first we need to identify what factors actually relate to driver distraction and what are the implications of distraction to driver safety. Once we understand that, then we can actually come up with some potential solutions. And potential solutions could be many different things. It could be education, it could be policies, laws, it could be technology, it could be even changes to the infrastructures. Maybe the way the roads are set up are such that it's too difficult to maintain a certain speed. But of course, when we implement all these solutions, we have to ask the question, do these solutions really work? And do they work given that drivers are just very, very different people? All of us are not the same. And we respond to things very, very differently. And it also depends on a lot of things that I'm going to talk about. So the first part of understanding how to do research in driver distraction is understanding what are the implications to driver safety. So when we look at the graphs of age-related differences for crashes, we have something called the bathtub effect. It's called the bathtub effect because it looks like a bathtub curve. But what you will see is that if we put on the x-axis the driver's age, we will notice that the younger and the older age groups are actually disproportionately high in terms of crashes when we take into account how many miles that they drive. So clearly, those two are two age groups that we want to be able to focus on. And out of those younger and older drivers, we tend to focus on younger drivers. Why? Because younger drivers tend to engage in more risky activities. They have actually been shown to have more crashes at night, when they actually have a higher propensity to speed and use alcohol and drugs. They're also more likely to use cell phones compared to any other age group. And because of that, they're more likely to be severely injured when they are using these types of distractions. They're also more likely to be involved in crashes when they are distracted. So this is one place that we want to start. And when we look at the crash data as well, and we look at the US general estimates, we can see that teenage drivers and those that are 20 to 24 actually have more crashes than those that are middle-aged, the bottom of the bathtub curve, the 35 to 55-year-olds. So from here, we can say, you know, how can we get some more information about these young drivers? So we actually did a focus group on young drivers based on the fact that we know that they actually have a higher propensity to be involved in crashes with in-vehicle distractions. And we did a study in the Seattle, Washington, as well as Iowa City. And so we were picking a rural and an urban area, trying to see if there's any differences. Now, there were some differences in terms of distractions. In Seattle, you'd see a skier off of Lake Washington, whereas in Iowa, you would see a deer coming by you. But for the most part, there's a lot of distractions that are still pretty prevalent in the car. So these were some of the responses that we got from young drivers in terms of like why they did distractions in their car and why they felt that it was okay or what they just felt about it. And so here are some of the responses that they gave us. I don't think it's how much you can do at one time, but good driving behavior. So it's okay to multitask as long as you just are a good driver. Parents freak me out. But friends help avoid accidents, even if I am more distracted with them. Just to let you know, studies show that among the younger drivers, that passengers actually have a high influence in terms of crashes compared to any other age groups. For other age groups, passengers actually act more like a co-pilot or help them. But among young drivers, they actually can be problematic because they kind of egg them on sometimes. The third one, I'd rather people make cell phone calls during slower stop-and-go traffic than at speeds of 70 miles per hour. I had a crash when I was late. I was putting on lipstick, but that was not the reason why I crashed. And then this very last statement, I think, is very telling of the young drivers, which is, are we really not aware that we are distracted, or is it that we don't care? I think it is more valuable to answer the phone. I think it is more valuable to answer the phone. And so it is these types of responses that make us think, what can we do to try to understand what is going through their heads, and also understand what is the big picture about what can we do to try to help them. So one of the things that we do a lot of is observations among risky drivers. And so we have lots of videos where we try to kind of capture what it is that they're doing and what are they attending to and what are they not attending to. So I'm going to show you 3 videos right now. These are actually part of a program called the Teen Safe Driver and Drive Cam for Families program. And what they did was, there was the American Family Insurance basically put these types of devices in 5,000 teen drivers across the country to try to get some valuable information so that we can kind of be able to, as researchers, look at these videos and then get some insights as to how we can actually design systems or provide policies or look at crash countermeasures to try to help them. And they're also available on YouTube if you actually want to get copies of them. So let me just kind of provide the context of what's going on. It's kind of a little bit shaded, but this driver, when you look at his eyes, he's actually looking down. He's texting. And so as he's texting, see what happens. So what happened here was, yeah, he's a little bit shocked. What happened here was he was looking down too long, and I'm going to run the video again. This time I ask you to count how long he was looking down. You can't see the device that he's using, but you can see him starting to veer off the road. So he starts looking down now, so it's 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. Kaboom. Well, how'd that happen? In this particular video, this girl is putting on lipstick, and it's the same scenario where she's putting on lipstick so she's not really watching the road, and she starts to veer off the road. The difference between this driver and the last one is the last one was on a real road. She's on the freeway. So as you'll notice, as she's putting on the lipstick, she's not really watching what she's doing, and she starts to veer off the road. As she's veering off the road, she doesn't realize that there's a car actually parked in the shoulder. And so she has to make a turn, and she overshoots herself, and this is why she actually is now facing the traffic instead of going along with the traffic. In this last one, this is very interesting too. So he's just tuning the radio. That's all he's doing. Difference, though, between this driver and the last two ones, he also does not have his seatbelt on, which, by the way, is a requirement in all states. You'll love his music. Oh, he's fine. He's just like this. So what happened here was if you look at the video, I'll play it one more time. If you look at his eyes, he's trying to figure out what station to go to before he gets to it. But when he looks up again, he doesn't realize that there's a slow-moving car coming, so he's trying to veer across it. And then he hits the curb. You I don't let my children wear their pants so loose. So anyway, from looking at the crash data, from trying to understand what we see, and then from looking at the videos, we want to see, are there ways that we can kind of provide some insights or maybe give young drivers an opportunity to learn from their mistakes so that they can perhaps be better drivers in the long run. So we look at education and policies. One of the big things that has come up with teen drivers is the graduate driver licensing program. This is actually a program that is implemented in various ways across the US. It's actually also implemented in Canada, New Zealand, as well as Australia. And what this program is designed to do is to phase in young drivers to full driving privileges in a safe environment. So what it does is it includes restrictions while you're involved in this program, so that in terms of like unsupervised night driving, that's not allowed, and also the number of passengers you have, and in particular, the number of teen passengers that you're supposed to have. There's also penalties if you're caught with no seatbelt, or if you're using a cell phone, or if you're texting. In other words, you might, depending on the state, have to wait longer before you can get a full license. So the big question, though, is do these programs really help, and do they help decrease the number of crashes among teen drivers? So we actually did a study like this when I was at the University of Iowa, using state of Iowa data. And when we look at the crash data, we see the following. So the red, yellow, and the green lines are the 16, 17, and 18-year-old drivers. And then the black line is the 25 to 54-year-olds, or the middle-aged drivers. The graduated driver licensing program came into effect in 1999 in the state of Iowa. And so the big question is whether or not graduate driver licensing program helped to reduce crashes. And when we just take an initial look at the data, let's say just do a before and after study, we can see that before the graduate driver licensing program, that there was actually more crashes than after. However, one of the other things that you may actually notice is that the slope of the line has actually been slowly decreasing anyway, starting from 1995. And actually, if you look at the number of licenses that have been issued in the state of Iowa, you can see that the 16, 17, 18-year-olds have actually, the number of licenses that have actually been issued has declined. So is the number of crashes declining because there's just less drivers on the road, or there are some other things? So another thing to kind of point out is that when they put in the graduate driver licensing program, some drivers actually opted or chose to wait until they were 18 to get full license without going through the intermediate program. So that's just kind of some of the data that we have. So from there, we then decided to do an analysis, but we wanted to make sure that we used a model that would effectively identify like all the things that we see. So this is an intervention time series model, because we have time series data, and we also have an intervention, the intervention being the graduate driver licensing program. And then we also wanted to make sure that those decrease that we see in teen drivers is not just something that's arbitrary, but that maybe it's something that's across all of the drivers in the state of Iowa. So we also have a covariate, or something that adjusts for a low-risk age group. So in this case, it was the 25 to 55 years. The other thing that you probably noticed was that there was a lot of fluctuation in the data. And so that's because there's a lot of seasonal effects. So in Iowa, and to some degree here in Washington, you'd see more crashes in January and December due to winter conditions compared to March and April. And so you would see that every year, and even if there is a decline. So that's also taken into account. So when we applied this model, we actually found out that among 16-year-olds, that yes, there was a significant finding in terms of decreases in crash. Yay, that was really exciting. However, for the 17 and 18-year-olds, there was actually no effects. Matter of fact, that slope of the line before the graduate driver licensing program was going to continue that way anyway. So even though while the teenage driver was in the program, they actually sustained some benefits, when they were no longer in the program, those benefits were no longer there. And so now they went back to whatever good or bad behavior that they actually had. And it's not a bad or good thing. It's just kind of like when they didn't have that reinforcement constantly, there may have been some other things that was going on. So those are some of the things that we wanted to be able to examine. And so given that you're in a graduate driver licensing program, and as well as driver's ed, there's a lot of people trying to give you some information, but they're not going to always be there. But yet what is going to always be there is your car. And so is there a way that we can actually mitigate the effects of distraction using technology? In other words, can we use technology to mitigate the effects of technology? And can we do that in your car? So we can do that actually across different time periods. And actually studies have shown that if you provide people information in real time, you could provide them some benefits in terms of whether or not something bad is about to go on and you better put your eyes back on the road. But there's good and bad to just that. The good is that you get immediate feedback on what you're doing wrong. The bad, though, is that if you're already distracted, do I want something else that's going to distract me? We can also provide information afterwards. So in other words, maybe providing real time is good, but maybe reinforcing that is better. And we can reinforce that perhaps by the minute that the trip is over, when you turn off your ignition, we can give you some additional information as to how your trip was in general, like a little trip report, a report card about whether or not you've had too many incidences, whether or not there were some things going on. So there could be good and bad associated with that as well. The good is you can now get an assessment of what you did for that trip so that hopefully the next time you're driving, you may actually not do certain things because you remember it. The bad, though, is that you may not always relate exactly how that distraction was based on the context of what you were doing. So is there a way that we can combine these two and maybe provide drivers some better benefits? So we did a study to assess the effects of real-time as well as post-trip information for young drivers, with the ultimate question, research questions being, can we help drivers get to their destination safely? And can feedback help provide drivers some information for long-term safe learning habits? So we did a study with 48 drivers. We used drivers between the ages of 18 to 21 because that would be the age after the graduate driver licensing program where they're on their own and they're driving in different situations. However, when you're working on a study, and this was in a driving simulator, we wanted to make sure that everybody had a US driver's license and also could speak English because a lot of our directions is in that. And we didn't want to have, we wanted to make sure that any changes that they had was not because of the directions, but because of their comprehension of other things. They were compensated for their time in participating in our study, and if any of you ever want to participate in a driving simulator or on-road study, talk to me. You can earn $15 an hour. You can be compensated $15. And then, because this particular study was done looking at driver distraction, we also wanted to give them incentive to use a driver distraction. So we gave them $10 more to perform this in-vehicle task, but not just $10. So it was a gradient where they would get up to $10 if they did the task well. So they just can't pretend like they're using the task, and I will show you what the task was in a minute. But that was what they were supposed to be doing in the driving simulator, which is engage in a distract task, and there was lead vehicles. There was vehicles in front of them that was braking. So they had to keep their eyes on the road while they were trying to use this device. And then at the same time, we would give them feedback based on their roadway and their driveway state as to whether or not they're doing something right or wrong. So this is what our it was a fixed-based driving simulator, and that top picture is an example of one. This is what a fixed-based simulator compared to a motion-based simulator means that there's no motion, but you can still hear sounds and you can kind of feel exactly where you are. We also had an eye tracker. The eye tracker was what basically allowed us to develop a system to give you feedback. And let me just kind of show you a picture of what that looks like. So this is actually the exact system that we happen to have here, which is a Face Lab. And what it does is it tracks your eye movements as you're driving. So you can see, like in this video, where that person is looking at all times and whether or not they can see, or if they're looking at the walls, at pedestrians, and also if they're looking down at their device. The other thing that we have was a distracting task. This is what I was saying that the drivers would interact with. This was actually displayed on the console right in the middle, like if you were thinking about where your navigation system is or where your radio is. It was a 7-inch touchscreen LCD display. And the device was actually set up to emulate if you were looking for a song on your iPod or if you were looking for the name of a person in your address book on your smartphone. But because of the fact that everybody comes from different backgrounds, we didn't want to have a song that's based on some popular rock song or classical or whatever. So my students actually came up with a term that nobody has ever heard of, which is Discover Project's Mission. And the goal of this task was actually very difficult. They had to match only one of the words in exactly the right place. So that it had to be discover in the first word, or project in the second word, or missions in the third word. So the task would be as follows. It would chime to let you know that you are ready to go ahead and get started. You will then scroll through 10 words and basically try to figure out which one is the match. So for example, in this first one, it says project, discover, misguide. This is not a match because none of these words are in the same placement as discover, project, missions. So the second one, if they were to scroll down to it, you will see that the word discover is in the first place that the phrase is discover. So this would be considered a match. Regardless of whether the participant had a good match or a bad match, once they made a selection, the system would chime again and then forget for them to start over. And then at the end of the drive, we would actually tally up how many they got right and wrong, and then they would get compensated for that amount. So while that distracting task was going on, we would also give them feedback as to whether or not they've been spending too much time on this particular device, and we want them to put their eyes back on the road. So we designed this algorithm based on looking at the different glance behaviors. And this was based on how often they were spending on the device and how frequently. And so the way this feedback works is if, let's say, the red line is actually your eye glance movements, and we can actually tell how many glances you have on the road as well as how many glances you have to the in-vehicle device. And what would happen is if you exceeded a certain threshold, then on that same device, you would get a little yellow bar that said, you have spent too much time looking at this device, you should probably put your eyes back on the road. Now, if you didn't listen to that yellow bar, and you went and you kept looking at the in-vehicle device, you would actually get another warning in addition to the yellow bar, a yellow bar and 2 orange bars that would say, if you don't put your eyes back on the road, you're probably going to crash. It doesn't say all those commentaries, but that's what they imply. The other thing that we did was once the ignition was turned off, we would give them feedback on how the trip was. And you know, for everybody, it's always good to give positive feedback as well as negative feedback. So the positive feedback was if you had absolutely no incidences and you didn't veer off the road, it would say, congratulations. Thanks for responding correctly to the 10 lead vehicle braking runs. You had no incidences. Now, if you did have a couple of incidences, it would actually give you a screen that looked something like this, where it says, thank you for responding to 5 lead vehicle braking events correctly, but there were 9 incidences, and then you can actually see where those 9 incidents were while you were driving. And then what you can do then is you can go to each one, and you can click on them to get some more information about what that incident was and how your driving was, and it would tell you what your distraction level was and whether or not it was a severe or critical event. So we did this basically, we had all these drivers in different conditions. We had some that had both the real-time and the post-trip information, the trip report. We had some that just had the trip report, and then we had those that didn't have any feedback at all as a comparison group. They actually did 4 separate drives, and a couple of the variables that we collected information on was something called minimum time to collision and the glance duration on the road. The minimum time to collision is basically the distance that you are in front of you. So it's a calculation of how far you are to the car in front of you in relationship to how fast you're going. So as you would expect, the further away you are from the car in front, the better it would be. So when we did this study, we were actually a little bit surprised because we saw that by drive 4, there was actually no difference between the no feedback, the trip report, as well as the combined feedback, and we just thought that was kind of interesting, but it wasn't what we had expected. So we saw differences in the first drive, but by the last drive, we didn't see any differences. However, when we looked at the eye glance behavior, we did notice that in the combined feedback, when they got the real-time information as well as the trip report, they did actually spend more time looking on the road. We just couldn't figure out why it wasn't translating into having them stay further away. So we decided then to do another study. We thought, well, maybe it could be that we're not grouping these young drivers appropriately. It could be that young drivers actually are made up, just like all of us, of very different characteristics. So that right now we think all young drivers are risky, but it could be that some young drivers are maybe not as risky, and their responses may actually cause some other differences. So we decided to conduct another study, this time with 53 different drivers. We examined them, though, not for over 4 drives, but over 8 drives. So we wanted to see long-term wise whether or not that they can get any benefits. And then the other thing that we did that was different, we actually took the very first drive was just a baseline drive so that we can get some measures about their glance behavior and then separate them out into, randomly to a feedback and a no feedback condition. But it was the same distracting task as well as the same types of lead vehicle braking events. So what we did then was we did a cluster analysis on just that baseline condition using Ward's hierarchical clustering method, and we saw that there was 3 clusters of drivers. And the 3 clusters of drivers looked something like this, based on the glances to the in-vehicle display and the number of glances. So what this means is that when we looked at this a little bit more closely, if we just separated it out based on the X and the Y measure, we noticed that the group that we actually decided to call high risk was high risk because if you look at their mean glance duration, it is actually much higher than those in the moderate and the low risk group. So they spent longer time looking at the in-vehicle display than on the road. And if you looked at the number of glances, the ones that were considered moderate basically had a lot of glances to the in-vehicle display, but just not as long. So in other words, what they did was they just kept looking back and forth from the in-vehicle device back to the road. So we looked at this group and we said, okay, there's a high-risk group that maybe we should take a look at some more. As a matter of fact, one of the things that's really interesting is that it's not just how long we look at a display, because some of us just tend to look longer at certain things than others. But it could be that when we look at crashes, it happens on the tail end of a distribution. In other words, those that spend a long time looking at it for certain situations, but it is just those certain situations when they look too long, that is when they get into a crash. Because if you remember looking at the videos, when we counted how long he was looking down at the text message, 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3 Mississippi, it was quite a long time. And actually studies show that when your glances are greater than 2 seconds, you are actually impacting your safety. And when we looked at the 95 percentile for the high risk, moderate risk, and low risk group, we can see that those that exceeded 2 seconds, if we look at the high risk groups, almost all of their responses exceed 2 seconds in the 95 percentile. So that is actually a problem. So giving them feedback might actually provide some benefits. So that's exactly what we looked at. When we actually separated out the drivers based on a feedback and a no feedback group, we noticed that in the no feedback group that they actually have higher or longer glances to the in-vehicle display, but once they were given some sort of a combined feedback, then actually their eye glances actually went down. So that was a good thing. The one thing that you'll notice is in the moderate and the low risk group, there's actually no differences between the feedback and no feedback group. In other words, they were actually, if you look at their responses, pretty low already. They were asked to interact with an in-vehicle device. And so that's pretty much as low as they can. But giving them that feedback actually just reinforced that they were actually spending less time on it. But the big question then is, how did these glance behaviors then translate back to looking at the distance that they stay away from the car in front? And what we found out was, going back to that same measure of minimum time to collision, that in the high-risk group, it actually did help. And you can see that with the feedback, which is the green line, that they actually stayed much further away, and even further away than the moderate and the low-risk group, compared to when they did not have feedback. So what this says is that young drivers clearly differ in their risk-taking behavior, and we probably shouldn't group all of our teenage drivers into one category. But it could be that they're not just all risk seekers, as we probably tend to think, but they just may be risk unaware. And that if we give them some information as to when their risks are just a little bit too high, they may actually provide some benefits. And indeed, the benefits for the highest risk group seems to be the most promising. However, when we look at technology, it tends to be expensive, but maybe we can use it in complementing it with education somehow. So that's kind of the next part, which is looking at the combination of education and technology. So when we're talking about feedback, feedback can actually be generated in many different forms. Yes, we can provide it in the car. Yes, we can go ahead and give you some information in the graduate driver licensing program. But we can also provide it a little bit later. So it's not just giving it in your car. It's not just when you turn off the ignition. But if we delay the time just a little bit more, we might be able to involve your parents. And so if we go ahead and provide trip reports to parents on a weekly basis, that might actually help not only enforce good learning, but good behavior over the long term. And I want to point out that when we talk about these types of studies, it's not parent monitoring, it's parent mentoring, because we want to be able to have parents, teach their child something, not just scold them about everything. And the way this system works, and this is actually the system that was in the videos, in the first three videos that you saw, the camera was basically placed right behind the rearview mirror, and the system is actually always on, but it only records when there is an abrupt braking or a steering event. So that's how they kind of, save on server space. But what it does is it provides, whenever something gets recorded, it blinks so that the driver knows that something is actually being recorded on them. And it records for 10 seconds before as well as 10 seconds after the event. And so all of these events get placed on a CD, and then end of each week, the parent actually gets that with a trip report, with a report card that basically gives them information on how many events they've had, whether or not they've been using their seatbelt that day, and some other things. The other thing it provides is where your child is in relationship to other children or other teenagers that are in the study. So you can see what's going on, and the goal is that you want your child to be on the smaller end over there. But what was really nice when we did this study at the University of Iowa, and this was actually a small study, but it was done over a 6-month period, we noticed that those that actually have the highest number of critical events, which were actually deemed the most risky drivers, actually were able to decrease the number of events that they had by the end of the 6 months. So this study is actually very consistent with what we saw in the technology in the simulator. In other words, that there are different types of drivers among young drivers, that there's those that are high risk and those that are younger. Those that are high risk and those that are low risk. But as you can see for the low risk, even though they were provided feedback, you don't see much change in their behavior over time. And it's exactly like what you would see in the simulator study, which is that they were already driving fairly safe, and so the system actually provides reinforcement that they're doing good, but that those that are actually at the highest risk in the beginning actually would reduce in terms of the number of critical events. And actually, at the end of this study, there was actually quite a few teenage drivers that didn't wear their seatbelts. There was 100% seatbelt use by the end of the study. So this is actually another video I wanted to show. And the reason why I wanted to show this is because, some of you may ask, why would anybody want to participate in these types of studies? Well, the first thing is that the teenage driver actually gets money for participating in the study. But the parents also, they need to sign something because they're minors, but they also need to be involved somehow. In other words, we need to have them basically sit down with their child at the end of each week, go through the videos, go through the trip report. In this video, this particular girl, I'm just going to explain the scenario and then I'll show it to you, which is she's actually in the middle of an intersection. And as you can see, and maybe you cannot, but these lights are green. So she's in the right in terms of she's in the middle of an intersection and she's about to make a left turn and she's just waiting. But then what happens is the light turns from green to red. And all of us who have driven for many, many years knows that when you're in the middle of an intersection and the light's about to turn to red, you can go ahead and proceed, because otherwise you'll be holding up traffic in the middle. So let me just show this to you.
Oh my God.
Okay, I'm going to play this one more time, but this time what I want you to do is when she's making that turn, observe the car that's coming. What happened was the car that was coming actually stepped on it and was trying to beat the yellow when it turns red. But as a novice driver, she didn't anticipate that that person was going to do that and just proceeded as she should. But if somebody who had been driving a lot more might have seen how quickly this person was going and may have avoided the accident. So watch the car over there.
Oh my God.
What is interesting about that video is because when the police came, they actually immediately gave her a ticket because of the fact that she was a teen driver. But they didn't know that she had a drive cam video. They didn't know that she had a video camera in her car. And actually, the other driver said it was her fault, too. The other driver said it was the teen driver's fault. So when they reviewed the videos, they cleared the teen driver and gave the other driver a ticket. So this is an example of why it would be good to actually, participate, because there's good and bad behavior, and you can kind of go through these videos with your teenager and explain like what could be done better, what maybe you could have looked at. And I think that's probably the best you can do. Overall, though, the research basically looks at the driver vehicle model. And we're talking about the driver, and we're thinking about what our internal model is of safe driving. There's many things that goes on in our heads. When we think about the environments, we think about what it is that we're going to be about to do, what is our intentions, how do we perceive the situation? Then we think about it, and then we go ahead and act upon it. And we act upon it either by stepping on the brake, stepping on the gas, steering, or something else. So that's how we interact with the vehicle. However, there's other things with regards to environment that can have a huge impact on whether or not the outcome will be safe or not. In addition, there are distractions, which is what we have here. And those distractions can have a huge impact also on our driver model. So what if we can provide different types of feedback? And feedback may not always be in real time. It could be right after the trip is over. It could be a little bit later, and even a little bit later after that. But if we give some sort of feedback and we connect it all together with the driver vehicle as well as the environment, then maybe we can provide a better model of internal safe driving for the driver so that they can perceive and act upon the situation a little bit better. So that kind of leads me now into what am I doing now and what are some of my ongoing studies. So as you can see, a lot of the research that I had began was in Iowa, and we're going to be doing some intervention studies here as well. I actually am working with the Harborview Injury Prevention Research Center, Dr. Ebo, on a study that we just got funded looking at intervention methods for teen drivers. And we're going to be installing a similar system in a small set of cars here in Seattle, so some of your teen drivers may be involved, and just to try to see if we can get some other feedback and try to understand what type of interventions would work best. The other thing that's important to note is that when we're thinking about intervention methods, it's not just for teens. As a matter of fact, we're also doing a study with commercial drivers. We're going to be instrumenting 270 trucks. And I don't know how many of you know this, but the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration just basically said there is no cell phone or text messaging use at all in your car while you're driving for work. And so we're going to be providing drivers with feedback on real-time, delayed, as well as cumulative feedback. So in other words, they're going to get information right there on the road, right when they turn off the car, and then they're going to also have to sit down with their safety supervisors and review the reports. And right now we're in pilot testing, and about 2 days after the text laws went into effect, every single driver that we have on video is texting. The other thing that's important is that we are talking about all these different types of technologies that we bring in the car. What about our car itself? What about that 2002 BMW that I showed you earlier? That's just not the only types of device, and there's going to be more. We have so many systems that may be safe, may be convenient. But how do people respond to them? And what happens when you have to use them over a long period of time? How do you adjust to it? And so we're actually doing research trying to understand how people adapt to these different types of behaviors. And we also look at the influence of distractions as well as these types of in-vehicle systems on other high crash risk groups, including older drivers, drivers with drug and alcohol impairments, as well as those that are cognitively impaired. And even though driver distraction is an impairment in itself, there's a lot of people that actually have other types of impairments, including the onsets of sleep apnea, Parkinson's disease, as well as Alzheimer's disease. Some of them don't even know that they have these types of diseases, and they're driving around with it, and we need to try to figure out what we can do to provide them some better information as to where they are and where they should be driving. I want to thank you very much for coming. I want to acknowledge who actually helped funded a lot of the research that I presented today. The U.S. Department of Transportation, NHTSA. Some of the work was funded by a National Science Foundation Career Award. I want to thank two wonderful students that I've had, David Nyans, who is still a PhD student in here, as well as Birsan Domes, who is now a professor at the University of Toronto. They got graduate fellowships to help with some of the research. Some of the teen mentoring study was based on my colleague Dan McGehee at the University of Iowa, and the teen videos I got that were for legal release came from DriveCam. And so if you have any additional information, that's my email, and all of my active projects are actually on my website. And just sort of like last words, don't text and fly.
That was great. So it was interesting when you were talking about the seat belts, right? That the teens didn't wear some of the seat belts and all that. And I remember, I'm sure there's enough people, because I see gray hair out there as well. I remember before there were seatbelt laws, all right? A lot of people out there remember that. At the time, the compliance rates were horrible.
That's correct.
When the first seatbelt laws. So we all know, and you said it during your talk too, that the compliance for texting now, the texting laws, no texting, no cell phoning, is horrible.
That's correct.
Okay. Do you see the same path though?
Yes, I do.
How long?
I don't know the answer to that. And actually that's a great comparison to the seatbelt laws, because actually that's the same comparison I use. When the seatbelt laws first came out, people, and just like with texting, those who were not going to wear the seatbelts are just not going to, and they would just hide their indiscretions better. And same thing with driver distractions. So this could actually be problematic. So unlike a seatbelt where some people just basically put because they put in the 3-point harness, they would just put it behind them, or they would just buckle in behind them. With cell phones, the biggest issue is that if you don't text in front view because you don't want to be caught, you would now text down here. The problem is now you have to look down to do this, and you have to look down a lot more, and it's actually much more dangerous. And so this could be a huge problem. So the impact of the texting law is actually questionable because there are some that will actually do very well and some that will not.
Yeah. I was intrigued by the timing you talked about, also watching the films when you say, one Mississippi, to watching someone when they're looking. And this 2 seconds as being a break seems to be a critical break point. Is there a physiologic basis for this? Or is it just the environment? You're going at a certain speed and it takes 2 seconds for something to show up.
I think it's both. There's definitely a physiological aspect to it because we can just respond so quickly to certain things. Then the other aspect is just based on lots of studies done on looking at how long we look at certain things and before we can actually respond appropriately. So it is physiological as well as the environment.
Okay. So let's get some of the questions from the audience. So what work has been done to make risky drivers aware of their potential impact on others, i.e. the very real and tragic consequences of risky behavior?
So, as part of the studies that I did with the National Science Foundation, speaking of teen drivers, one of the things that I've done is go to different driver education programs to give talks and show some of the videos on what has been dangerous in terms of teen driving. Actually, my daughter just finished the teen driver education program, and I was actually privileged enough to sit in on a couple of them. It was actually kind of interesting because I called them and I said, how does my daughter take the bus to Northgate? And they said, you're not coming? And I said, well, I've got to teach that day. And they go, but studies show that parents should be involved and we can have less crashes. And I said, okay, I didn't know that. But anyway, my point in bringing that up was because when I did show up on that first day, they actually had some of the studies that we did cited in there.
So the next question is perfect. How do you interact with your own children who are learning to drive?
So what I was
Do
saying,
you yell at all?
I was saying during the break, I have an inside voice and an outside voice. My outside voice says, honey, you shouldn't do that, you know. Inside is, I told you not to do that. But no, seriously, when I actually have been taking my daughter on a lot of drives, and we've been trying to go through a lot of safe driving habits, I will be very honest in saying with your own child, it's much more difficult than I had bargained for. And I actually sit down, I show her some of the videos, and I kind of stop it at different points to go through what she could do right or wrong. But experience is a key factor, though.
She have her license yet?
No.
Okay. This one, so we saw the segmentation between risky, non-risky behavior, but there's another obvious one according to this questionnaire, which is the obvious gender differences. So have these been segmented by gender, these data, and are there any significant gender differences?
Actually, it's funny that you say that because in one of the slides, the one on focus groups, those were all females, by the way. They were all females, and actually females if you looked at some of the data that we have done on gender differences, females in the beginning tended to multitask a lot more than males, because males had more obvious risk seeking, they would cut in front of cars. But females, it is really funny because they said that they were always correcting their boyfriends or husbands or whatever, but if they looked at their own behavior, they can see that they actually did quite a bit of different things that they probably should not have done either.
Good. This is
good?
The next one's very good, even though written on the wrong paper. It's very good because this is something I've thought about because I travel a lot, and that is distraction more of a problem when you're driving a rental car versus your own car?
That's a really good question. I don't know the answer to that.
Well, speculate.
I speculate that it is more of a problem because when I get into a rental car, I have absolutely no idea where anything is. I actually drove a rental car, and I didn't even know how to turn on the headlights. And I got stopped by a police officer. I did not get a ticket for this, by the way. But he just stopped me, and he goes, what's going on? And I was explaining to him that I was in a rental car, and he was like, stupid, it just turned it on.
Okay, here's one which is more of a sociology question, but let's go after it. So in films, countless people look at somebody who's next to them and talk, and right, and they go on for 2 minutes, and obviously nothing happens where we saw this 2 to 3 second law. Do you think that sets patterns of behavior, that it looks acceptable to those who are role models?
Well, in the 50s and 60s, people used to always smoke cigarettes, and did that set a pattern of behavior for that generation in terms of smoking? I don't know, but I don't think it looks good. It looks like it's an easy task to do, to just watch them texting and talking on the phone for long periods of time. I don't think it's a good behavior, but I'm not really sure how to tell the motion picture industry that with alcohol and drugs and...
Well, we got the next one. Why isn't there more concern for drinking coffee?
So there was a 100-car naturalistic study done at Virginia Tech about 4 or 5 years ago, and actually one of the things that they did quantify was coffee drinking as well as cigarette smoking, and they did show that there was slight risk, but it's not as big as texting and using their cell phones, and so that I think is why it hasn't gotten as much prominence.
Right. Okay, so do you believe, or is there any evidence that teens will tamper with the monitoring equipment?
Yes, I do think that they will tamper with the equipment, quite frankly. I really do. Not only that, there is one other thing I want to bring up since you said that. We noticed that teens, over time, were able to decrease the number of critical events. What we were not able to show in that pilot study was whether or not they were able to hide it better or figure out how to not trigger it off, which is why we're doing another study here in Washington to look at more of a control measure. Same thing with the truck driver study. I should tell you that truck drivers are very prone to breaking anything that watches them. In one of the videos, they actually put their baseball cap on the camera so we couldn't see anything.
Wonderful, wonderful. Okay. Could good driving behavior be motivated by the same types of incentives that are effective with operators of other transports, such as airline pilots? What may be transferable Is there anything transferable that we know from others?
Oh, yeah, I see what you're saying. So
Yeah.
basically, is the research that we see in driving transferable to like airlines
Yes,
or maritime?
or vice versa.
Absolutely. As a matter of fact, a lot of the research in driving actually started in aviation in terms of like situation awareness, trying to understand their surroundings, how they perceive things, looking at all the different types of displays and dials that they had. So yes, absolutely.
Okay. All right. Good one here. So we focused on the younger age group. The greater than 64 in the bathtub curve went up. What about feedback for them? Does it make a difference?
Well, older people don't like to have too much technology in their cars.
I'm only about 5 years away from this,
So we actually did a study, an on-road study, with drivers between 65 to 80 years old. And all we asked them to do was drive through an intersection without any distracting devices. And 2 of the drivers just went right into oncoming traffic. This is without a distracting device.
So the seasonal effects you showed in the Iowa,
Yeah,
there seemed to be a spike right around Christmas and New Year's.
that's correct.
What is it?
It's the winter months. It's basically December and January. It's winter months, so there's a lot of snow, adverse weather conditions, slippery roads. And so it's actually, you're more likely to have crashes.
Would we see that in Southern California?
No, but you would see that on the Snoqualmie Pass. You would. I actually have data from the Snoqualmie Pass that shows the same kind of spikes in the same months.
So let's thank our speaker again for today.
Thank you.
Thanks, Linda.